Let's talk about the legacy of nationalism. Nationalism advances the idea that people of a nation share a common ancestry, a common language, common culture. However, the vast majority of nations, if not all, are made up of very diverse populations. Historian Benedict Anderson suggested that nations are actually imagined communities. That is, they are communities in which people overlook the differences between them in order to construct an identity around the idea of their nation. We ignore the differences. We imagine we're the same, but we're all very different. So let's read this quote by Karl Deutsch. A nation, so goes a rueful European saying, is a group of persons united by a common error about their ancestry and a common dislike of their neighbors. So you see, nationalism isn't so much about how similar we are, but pointing to some other group saying, hey, they're different than us. And that kind of binds you together by looking at other groups. You see yourself as a distinct group. Voltaire, an Enlightenment thinker from the 1700s. Voltaire is known for his ironic wit. However, in many of his sayings, such as the one above, there are kernels of profound truth. So let's take a look of this profound truth Voltaire is going to offer us. It is clear that one country cannot gain without another losing, and that it cannot conquer without making misery. Such then is the human state, that to wish for one's country's greatness is to wish harm on to one's neighbor. He who should wish his fatherland's might never be greater, smaller, richer, poorer, would be the citizen of the world. So, do we agree with Voltaire that for one nation to become stronger, others must suffer and decline? What does he mean by a world citizen is one who does not wish his country to be greater or richer? I think he means that competition between nations creates misery, and to abandon that competitive spirit is to act in the best interest of all the world's countries. Nationalism and imperialism. European motives for conquering Africa included the need for raw materials and industrial production, new markets for their products, and the desire to exploit the vast mineral wealth of Africa. European nations also sought to advance their national power with respect to other nations through the conquest and control of foreign territories. Imperialism can be defined as the policy by a stronger nation to attempt to create an empire by dominating weaker nations economically, politically, culturally, or militarily. This definition is from a book, America, Pathways to the Present. Imperialism in the 19th century provided an outlet for nationalism. They go hand in hand. The more nationalistic you are, the more imperialist you become. If a nation could increase its imperial possessions, it could alleviate the standing of its citizens among the peoples of Europe. Elevate, make you greater than everyone else. New military might could be used not only to subdue indigenous peoples and gain control of their lands, but also to keep other European nations from gaining control of those lands. And it's worth noting this imperialism spreads to Asia as well. It wasn't just Africa that got colonized. And World War I had a lot to do with nationalism. Along with imperialism, nationalism was seen as a major reason for the outbreak of World War I. Competition for colonies, militarism, and an arms race were fueled by nationalism in the late 19th century and early 20th century. In addition, nationalism was not confined to large countries. By the beginning of the 20th century, many small countries like Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina wanted to be free from domination by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. This Balkan nationalism, this Slavic nationalism, would trigger the event that led to the start of the war. It was an act of defiance against Austrian imperialism when Giuseppe Princeps assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. He didn't do it because he was crazy. He did it because he was nationalistic. Nationalism in the 20th century. Well, nationalism continued to be a factor in world affairs into the 20th century. It was a major element in the propaganda machines used by fascist governments to rally their citizens prior and during World War II. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco in Spain all used nationalism to gain power. It was also a factor in bringing colonialism to an end. As Asian and African states had been controlled by European countries, it made them want to be independent from these colonies. It was nationalism that makes you want to be independent. Stateless nations. A gray area in the exploration of nationalism is the concept of a stateless nation. The question arises here: what is a nation? Is a sense of common cultural identity sufficient? Or do a people need to speak the single language, live in a clearly identifiable territory, and have an integrated economy? Jews did not achieve a nation until the middle of the 20th century with Israel, while Kurds, Palestinians, Basques struggle for national recognition even today. Which of these three nations would give up territory to the Kurds? Which of these nations would welcome a new nation to be founded between them? How can the Kurds maintain a distinctive identity when they live in three different nations, subjected to three different sets of laws and customs? These are some of the difficult questions of nations and nationalism today. The Kurds are a nation of people, but not a nation as in territory, sovereignty, language. They're all over the place, but they're all Kurdish people. Just a little something to challenge the traditional idea of nations as states. This statue of Garibaldi teaches Italians about their history and reminds them of the processes through which Italy was created. The historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote about how monuments and memorials create national traditions through which nationalist history and identity are fostered. Can you think of any monuments or memorials commemorating history in the United States? Perhaps the Washington Monument is a nice symbol. It talks about the revolution, our first president. That monument gives you feelings of nationalism and the birth of our country, our common history. And that is the end of our nationalism lesson.